My name is Dave Lincicum. I teach the New Testament and related subjects at the University of Notre Dame. So even though I'm a New Testament scholar by training, the issue of gun violence is something that's mattered very deeply to me, and in fact, to my own family. I grew up in a central California town called Visalia, and when I was growing up in the 90s, my cousin, who was just a year or two older than me, she was at dinner one day at a Carl's Jr. hamburger joint, and she was there with her husband and their 3-year-old daughter. And just across the parking lot, a shootout ensued, and a stray bullet came through the restaurant, hit Jeff in the head, and Jeff died in front of his 3-year-old. In fact, for a long time, their 3-year-old daughter just didn't understand what had happened, and she thought that her mother had killed her father. So it just totally destroyed this beautiful family. Now, as a New Testament scholar, when I think about gun violence, I feel at one level just entirely powerless, as so many of us do. But then I thought, well, what can I do as a New Testament scholar? Well, we can talk with the New Testament. We can ask our questions to the New Testament about the gun and see what we can get to. So today, I want to focus on a particular question about the gun, and that's about gun ownership. Does the New Testament have anything to say to the question about whether a Christian should own a gun? So this is the question now. Can a Christian own a gun? Bracketing for the moment statistical arguments and more practical considerations, today I'd like to think about what the gun offers to the individual and how this squares with the New Testament's understanding of the person's role in the world. More forcefully put, my thesis here is simple. The gun is a temptation to arrogate life-destroying power to the wielder and should be resisted by those who follow in allegiance to a crucified Messiah. So to back up this thesis, I'm going to be a little bit old-fashioned and present 8 sub-theses. So here we go with thesis 1. Technologies extend the range of moral choices and possible actions available to the user. So technologies, of course, are the result of human craft, and when they're concentrated in discrete physical instruments, they're no longer just inanimate objects. The sociologist Bruno Latour writes that when a person and a gun interact, there's a mutual transfiguration of both subject and object into a new composite. As he puts it, you're different with a gun in your hand. The gun is different with you holding it. You are another subject because you hold the gun. The gun is another object because it has entered into a relationship with you. The gun is no longer the gun in the armory or the gun in the drawer, or the gun in the pocket, but the gun in your hand, aimed at someone who is screaming. In other words, to hold a gun is to find oneself faced with an extended range of possible actions. But if a gun extends the range of possible actions available to a person, it also extends the range of possible moral actions, and so opens that person up to new possibilities of moral scrutiny. Okay, that's thesis 1. Now, thesis 2. A person wielding a gun has an enlarged range of possible actions before him or her at any time, including the option to fatally shoot another human. Thus, the choice to carry or wield a gun should be conceived as a conscious decision to extend one's moral capacities to include killing instantly. So fatality belongs properly to the telos of a weapon. That is to say, a gun is designed for the purpose of killing. To use a gun to hammer a nail or squash a fly is possible, but the gun is designed to kill. And in that sense, we might say the gun wants to kill. We tend to trade in euphemisms, so we might say that we'd like to have a gun for safety, for peace of mind, for protection, or just in case. But any serious consideration must clear-sightedly remember precisely what a gun is designed to do and the capacity it gives its user. It would be clearer to say that we desire to own a gun in order to kill instantaneously should the necessary occasion arise. Needless to say, to navigate the world with a capacity for instantaneous lethal force is to navigate the world as a profoundly different type of self than that envisaged by Jesus and his first followers. Okay, so now thesis 3. The action of killing instantly or attempting to do so can be undertaken with a variety of motives, self-defense, aggression, greed, intervention in a violent conflict, and so it can be morally evaluated in different ways. But humans act under the influence of passions, basic emotions and dispositions that incline us toward one course of action or another. So it would be counterproductive and wrong-headed to consider unprovoked murder with a gun as morally equivalent to killing in self-defense. But when violent force might be justified or necessary, even in self-defense, is not at all obvious. Even under normal circumstances, people struggle to make maximally rational decisions. Their ability to do so very quickly and under the influence of intense emotions is even less. Now, the New Testament envisions humans as subject to self-deception and violent tendencies, and doesn't think of fear or self-defense as a legitimate motive for violence or lethal force. The Apostle Paul considers humanity under the regime of the flesh to be given to strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, and envy, as he says in Galatians 5. Even if he believes that those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires, he's well aware of the ongoing threat of regression and instructs Christians against letting sin exercise dominion in your mortal bodies to make you obey their passions. Even the crucified Christian's members are potential instruments of wickedness. Paul's realistic anthropology calls into question any view of human decision-making that sees us as just coolly rational and able to fulfill the role of judge in an untroubled manner without passion clouding our minds. Rather, Christians taught by Paul should be suspicious of our own motives, our own propensity to rationalize a course of action, and even to justify violence as necessary. Okay, now for thesis 4. Above all, the New Testament envisions the Christian life as a via crucis, a following after the one who was subjected to violent mistreatment and did not resist in return. The call to the imitation of Christ means nothing if not this. The Gospels are relentless in their depiction of the disciples as those who follow after Jesus. Mark, for one, is explicit about where this leads. From Galilee, where Jesus calls the disciples, along with him on the Isaianic way to Jerusalem to die. Mark's Jesus calls readers beyond the text and beyond the circle of his first followers. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Now notice the address here is generalized. If anyone wants to follow Jesus, they must be prepared to suffer the way he did, passively, at the hands of those wielding violent power, to death. So is it possible to imitate Christ while at the same time standing one's ground? Can I exercise my legal right to shoot someone who breaks into my house, killing them for the attempted theft of my property or harm to my person, while at the same time imitating the one who, in the words of 1 Peter, when he was abused, did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Would that impulse towards self-defense not be wanting to save my life, the very thing that Jesus says will lead to its ultimate loss? The master narrative of the Christian faith involves Jesus facing those who wish to take his life and renouncing the violent strategies of resistance that might have saved him. That's the narrative that wants to structure Christian practice in the world, rather than the counter-narrative that enshrines a violent hero who overthrows the evildoers with a superior display of marksmanship. The famous good guy with a gun story, just so alien to basic Christian sensibilities, but so familiar to American ears. All right, now thesis 5. The Gospels depict Jesus himself as prohibiting acts of violence, even in self-defense, and speaking against being seized by the fear of death, which he considered only a penultimate reality. Do not resist an evildoer, Matthew 5:39, is one of the Sermon on the Mount's pronouncements that the church has been squirming under for 2,000 years. But the command is clear. It's not supplied with exception clauses, unless they're attempting to take something that's yours or unless they're trying to hurt you. And the call to nonviolent resistance is striking. As one of the earliest commentators on Matthew wrote, "For if you strike back, you have denied that you are Christ's disciple, not with words, but with deeds." So even if we would suggest to Jesus that he makes some exceptions, the command goads us repeatedly. It challenges us to become a sign of contrast to the broader world in which Christians live. Indeed, when offered the opportunity to sanction acts of violence in defense of himself at his arrest, Jesus declines and instructs his disciples not to pursue force. Nor does Jesus indicate that fear of death is an acceptable motive for violence. Rather, he urges, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. And Paul, for his part, urges doing good to one's enemies. So now, thesis 6. At least in part, the New Testament's prohibition of self-defense or self-preservation depends on the eschatological suspension of the quest for justice or retribution. By that, I mean the conviction that things will be put right, not in the present evil age, as Paul calls it, but in the age that is to come, not by human will, but by God's unerring restorative judgment. This eschatological suspension seems to make sense of Paul's radical view, which is so contrary to our present sensibilities, that if for this life only we've hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Paul and the evangelists expect that life in the crucified Messiah's retinue will be cruciform, leading to suffering and even to death. Nowhere do they place such value on continuing to live in this present evil age that they're willing to envisage armed defense. Rather, they're motivated by a robust hope in some future beyond this vale of tears, and they share with the early martyrdom literature the conviction that Christian bravery in the face of death consists in love and testimony, not violent resistance. 1 Peter invokes Jesus' own hope in the one who judges justly as underwriting his non-retaliation in the face of suffering. More pointedly, when Paul ponders the enduring love of Christ, he forcefully denies that even violent death, by the sword, can separate us from this love. Who will separate us from the love of Christ, he asks. Will hardship or distress, persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? By no means. The hope of that enduring love underwrites the risk of nonviolence by emphasizing that death does not have the last word. All right, now we come to thesis 7. The New Testament does not know the Enlightenment language of rights, but speaks of authority delegated by God to be used in the interest of human flourishing. Even then, in the situations of the conflict of goods, the Apostle Paul recommends privileging love over a private good and draws a stark distinction between the permissible and the commendable. So if the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution confers the right to bear arms, should the individual Christian take up that right or refuse to do so? It's instructive to consider Paul's example in 1 Corinthians 9. While navigating tensions around the insistence of some Corinthians that they have the right to eat food sacrificed to idols, Paul supplies his own practice as an example. As an apostle, he has the authority to insist on being paid for his work, and he's in a position to rightfully demand financial support from the Corinthians and other communities to fund his apostolic vocation. But, he says, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. The gospel and the love of others it demands are more important than individual choice. If we take this to be a statement that walking according to love entails renouncing the right of private choice for the sake of another's flourishing, we might imagine Paul addressing American Christians today in light of the tragic statistics of human devastation to which gun usage in this country has led. For if, for the sake of owning a gun, he might say, your brother or sister is grieved, you're no longer walking according to love. Do not, for the sake of mere gun ownership, destroy that one for whom Christ died. Okay, we come now finally to thesis 8. Nowhere does the New Testament envision the state and its laws as superseding the example of Jesus or the common tradition of the church. The state cannot allow the Christian to do something that Jesus forbids. Rather, the New Testament casts the assembly of believers as the determinative body of moral action, a countercultural community whose symbol is the cross. In other words, the New Testament envisions the Christian community as the normative culture in which values and moral virtues are formed. But it's just here that we come up against one of the most troubling elements of American gun ownership. At least 25% of gun owners say that owning a gun is a very important part of their overall identity, with another 25% saying it's somewhat important. This identity-shaping aspect of gun ownership might call to mind the identity-shaping claims of another community. In fact, American gun culture fulfills many of the same functions the church has traditionally fulfilled. The gun, it seems, serves as an instrument of cultural formation. It gives to its owners by giving them each other and by helping them find a place to belong. It's interesting that we seem to acknowledge this in the way we speak. A gun transforms one into a new category of person, a gun owner, though we don't speak with such identitarian language about, say, desk owners or knife owners. In this sense, the purchase of a gun is a sort of ritual of initiation. The gun is an invitation, a handshake, a rite of entry. And so it is, for some gun owners at least, that the cultural trappings of this subgroup of fellow gun owners have offered such a sense of belonging and community building that to raise the possibility of limitation or control of guns is to threaten their very sense of self. We're therefore talking not merely about incidental ownership of a discrete object, but about a form of self-formation through collective belonging mediated by the gun. In other words, the gun takes on a symbolic function that depends on but exceeds its mechanical function. It's a community centered around an object, but not merely an object in its own right, rather an object as symbol. But what are we to make of a community whose organizing symbol is the gun? Can it also be Christian? The Christian community, of course, already has its own organizing symbol, the cross. One is a reminder of violence suffered unjustly, while the other is a call to resist violently the threat of violence. So to be precise, this would be to substitute a symbol of retaliation for evil for a symbol of non-retaliation for evil. And it's difficult to see how those things can be easily reconciled. So, in conclusion now, can a Christian own a gun? In these reflections, I've tried to argue that the broad shape of the New Testament's vision of bodily life in this world militates against that possibility. The Christian should be a signum amoris, a sign of love, marked by contrast, rather than an armed reflection of the armed world. The gun is a temptation to become a kind of powerful self with a capacity to kill instantaneously. This is an arrogation of power that the New Testament's witness does not support, even in self-defense. The past few years have set records for background checks for gun purchases, with millions of checks being initiated each month. Undoubtedly, hundreds of thousands of those checks, if not millions, were initiated by Christians. It's important to pause and think about that for a moment. For anyone to responsibly purchase a gun, unless it's with the sole intention of, say, hunting or sport shooting, they must at some point imagine a scenario in which they would use the gun against a human. Maybe they imagine an intruder in their house, or a carjacker, an active shooter, or some other kind of threat. Odds are that most people, to have reached the point of buying a gun, have imagined such scenarios dozens of times. This means they've habituated themselves to these acts of lethal imagination. Many will eventually have practiced with targets outlining the human body. Their fantasized anger toward an other, the will that an other die rather than oneself, is enacted and internally reinforced again and again, whether or not they're ever presented with the opportunity to enact it externally. So how can such people meet a stranger as a neighbor? For those who look to the Gospels for guidance, will they not hear Jesus urging them to consider even dangerous strangers more dear to them than blood relations? Who then is my neighbor? Is that very question not something that should haunt the one who carries the technology of lethal force on their person or stores it in their house? Have I imagined killing my neighbor over and over again? Have I habituated myself to violence with the intention that I should kill effectively when my neighbor confronts me? How then can I fulfill the second commandment, to love my neighbor as myself, if I'm preparing myself to kill him if necessary? Now, these are rhetorical questions, but they're not merely rhetorical. And as I read the New Testament, it offers us a consistent challenge to our easy acceptance of gun ownership. And that's a challenge that each one of us needs to think about individually.